It's Monday, the 7th of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tom Hunt, Shadow Justice Secretary Steve Reed, the i-Newspaper's policy editor Jane Merrick and Sunday Times columnist Charlotte Ivers. Today.
It shouldn't be sent. And, you know, no one should send other people messages like that.
A complaint of alleged bullying and intimidation against Gavin Williamson. So why did the Prime Minister give him a job in government? And was the Home Secretary, whom the Prime Minister reappointed, on top of her brief?
The risk is that some people will go weak and wobbly on net zero. We can't have that.
That warning from the former Prime Minister as world leaders get in the picture at the Climate Change Summit in Egypt.
You're commentating there, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm commentating.
There's another option. You stay at home and highlight the abuses. You don't have to go and take the Qataris' money.
And the moral dilemmas of a World Cup in Qatar. Now, after some toing and froing on behalf of the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, he is at the COP Climate Change Summit in Egypt. While he's there, let's just show you this headline in The Sun. He's going to be meeting with the French President. In Boat's vow, Rishi Sunak to demand British boots on French beaches when he meets Macron as he vows to get a grip of Channel crisis. Some of you will remember Liz Truss was asked during the leadership campaign, seems like an age ago, in the summer, about whether the French president was a friend or foe. So my question to you all today is, are the French a friend or foe when it comes to tackling the small boats crisis? Tom?
I think in general the French are clearly a friend. But I do think it's critically important that the Prime Minister and the President of France can find out a way of sorting this problem out, because I don't think it's not without negatives for the French either. So I think it's in both of the Prime Minister's interest and the President's interest to find a way of resolving this. The idea about having British boots on the ground in France, I think, is a good one. I think it's part of the solution. So
you said in general France is a friend. On this specific issue, is Emmanuel Macron a friend when it comes to, as you say, tackling the issue of small boats crossing the Channel?
Well, I think, we will be looking at those negotiations, we'll be seeing what the output is. But clearly, as a Member of Parliament who, frankly, is at hotels being requisitioned in my constituency, it's of immense concern for my constituents. What I am seeing is a solution that comes out of those discussions that means that my constituents don't have that worry anymore.
Friend or foe?
Well, they're not just our friends, they are our essential partners in dealing with this problem. And we cannot tackle the people smugglers, the people traffickers who are responsible for putting these individuals on boats in Calais and then sending them into the Channel without close cooperation with the French. And it's been distressing now over years, to be honest. Boris Johnson comparing them to Nazis, Liz Truss saying that she didn't know whether Macron was a friend or an enemy. How do you get collaboration with our close neighbour, France, if you're going to abuse them in that way? And, the system is broken, as Suella Braverman said, but who broke the system? Because this government has been in power for 12 years, and it's not just the matter of people getting on boats. It's also what happens to them when they get here, because they're not processed for months or sometimes years, and when they are processed and they fail to be categorised as asylum seekers, they're not removed. Now, that is a broken system, and the Tories broke it.
Is language important here, Tom Hunt? As Steve referred to Liz Truss saying the jury was out on the issue of whether France is a friend or foe.
Well, to be perfectly honest, Liz Truss is a former Prime Minister. I'm not actually that interested in spending time talking about what a former Prime Minister
is the language important?
I'm interested in what the current Prime Minister is saying. I think the outputs are vitally important. And I think clearly, the way in which we talk about allies is of significance. But frankly, we've been waiting for years for this problem to be sorted out. And actually, in terms of the opposition, I do find it slightly ironic. Now, the Shadow Home Secretary has been very vocal on this recently. Let's not forget that she actually brought an urgent question to Parliament opposing the use of Napier barracks for illegal immigrants, who's now also kicking off at her in hotels. What does she want? The solution the Labour Party would have would pretty much be to grant everyone refugee status immediately, and of course that approach would mean there is no back.
Tom tells us we've been waiting for years. They've been in power for 12 years. Now, do you know, of the 16,000 asylum seekers who were identified over the last 18 months for removal to a safe third country, do you know how many your government removed? 21 out of 16,000. That is sheer incompetence
would you support,
on your part. And one of the reasons that people are coming over is because they know your government will take years to process them, and if they fail, it will never remove them. That is all your government's doing, I'm afraid.
Would you support a narrow definition for refugees?
Why don't you start processing people who are coming here and then removing the ones who fail to get asylum? Then you wouldn't have all of these people squeezed into camps like Manston.
But if the outcome...
It's not about defining definitions. We've got definitions.
Well, it is part,
You're not applying the definitions you've got.
If part of
because the government's too incompetent to process and remove.
If we process them more quickly, but the outcome is they all get to stay, which they probably could do under a very liberal definition of refugee.
Do you think that's good?
That's not a good outcome. Okay? We've got a Labour Party. We've got a Labour Party who stood on a platform of free movement. We've got a shadow Home Secretary.
Keir Starmer was very clear at PMQ that no one on this side supports freedom of movement.
Who broke the system?
We've got a shadow Home Secretary who said that Napier Barracks is OK for our armed services personnel, but isn't OK for illegal immigrants.
All right, I'm going to bring in our other guests, but just before we move on, you rightly identified Liz Truss as a former Prime Minister, but you did support her during the leadership, didn't you?
Look, I make it very clear that, that I supported Kemi Badenoch in the early stages of the contest. When there was I find aspects of what she was looking to achieve in terms of tax cuts attractive. The way in which it was followed through clearly was not a good situation, not a good outcome.
Are the French a friend or foe when it comes to tackling the issue of small boats crossing the Channel?
Well, of course they're a friend. I mean, they're one of our closest long-term allies. But there has to be constructive dialogue on both sides. And I think actually Macron is, he was quite gracious actually when Liz Truss said the jury was out. He gave a very gracious response. I think he wants to be constructive with Rishi Sunak to find a solution. But there has to be construction on both sides. There has to be a proper dialogue. It's got to be meaningful. It can't just be about Britain asking for more for observers on the ground. There has to be more from the French as well, I think, because the solution to this problem has to involve the French.
Charlotte?
I think certainly they are a friend, they're an ally of the UK, but there is a question of just practicalities. Many French officials view this as a British problem. They don't see why their resources should be taken up, their time should be taken up. And so you do see a bit of pushback on that front. And when it comes to British observers as well, there are questions over sovereignty, which are being raised by French officials as well. So there are two countries here with slightly conflicting goals, but of course two very close allies which do intend to work together as well on this problem.
Let's stick with the issue.
I think it's really important we bring in some legal changes. I was pleased to see we're going to be bringing a Bill of Rights back, which I think will enable us to deliver things like the Rwanda policy that Labour voted against. Labour also voted against the Borders Bill. So I think it's incredibly important we find out from the Labour Party. Would you support a UK Bill of Rights?
That makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. Do you know what percentage of asylum seekers you process within a year? 96% you don't. Instead of talking about ripping up the legal protections that protect the British people about an overbearing government and would actually make no difference at all, you should focus on processing the people that are coming into the country faster and removing those that fail. 21 out of 16,000 is shocking. Even you must think that's shocking, and you voted for Liz Truss.
It's really clear that the European Convention of Human Rights is one of the key reasons why we couldn't deliver a Rwanda policy.
Do you know what? Under the Labour government,
the UK Bill of Rights will make it clear that the UK courts are sovereign.
Under the Labour government,
would Labour support that?
Twice the number of foreign terrorists were removed under the Labour government than the Conservatives. The same Human Rights Act was in place then. The issue is the incompetence of your government, not the legislative framework.
We're going to stick with the Home Affairs and the Home Office because those who are eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that Grant Shapps was Home Secretary in between Suella Braverman being forced to resign the first time under Liz Truss and then being reappointed 6 days later when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. Grant Shapps was asked about the situation at the Manston Asylum Processing Centre when he stepped in. Let's have a listen to what he said.
Well, certainly the concern was that we would be in a position where people were unintentionally being detained, which wouldn't be legal. So I wanted to make sure we remained within the law, or at least showed that we were trying to rectify the situation. As I say, the advice I had was very, very clear on that. And the Home Secretary obviously agrees because she's continued to follow the same policy that I put in place.
How did you read those comments from Grant Shapps? Some might have said or judged it that he was effectively saying that Suella Braverman was close to perhaps ignoring that legal advice.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, Grant Shapps was in the job, as you say, for 6 days. He's also a key ally of Rishi Sunak, so he's coming from a certain sort of position here in Cabinet. He's got the strength to be able to say this, which is fascinating. And obviously, Suella Braverman is in her position is still in doubt because of the crisis over asylum and other issues to do with her conduct. And I think he's raised a really important point that actually once you have a centre that's no longer doing processing, that's keeping people beyond when they should be, there's terrible conditions that were unveiled last week about diphtheria and other issues. And I think Grant Shapps is very cleverly pointing out that actually if he'd remained Home Secretary, he probably would have got to grips with the situation better than Suella Braverman.
How did you read it, Charlotte?
You know what, when I saw that, I actually had to go and Google just to double check because I thought, Grant Shapps, he's still in the Cabinet, right? Because that didn't feel like someone who was talking about someone on their own side. And look, the government are expecting legal challenges over this situation, and there is a denial from Suella Braverman that she received legal advice, which she ignored. But clearly what we've seen here is extremely messy. Clearly the government are now scrambling to try and fix it. You've seen the Immigration Minister, for example, visiting the site and trying to get people removed from it as quickly as possible. But this has been a fairly long-running nightmare for the government, really, and for the people who are kept there.
Right, and also it is and lends itself to this idea and challenge for Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister of healing divisions within the Conservative Party and perhaps even within the Cabinet itself. He promised a government of integrity, professionalism and accountability. We're going to judge how that's going by showing you in just a moment a series of WhatsApp exchanges that involve a now Government Minister, Gavin Williamson, and the former Chief Whip under Liz Truss, Wendy Morton. Let's just show you the first one. These were revealed at the weekend. Gavin Williamson, it's very clear how you are going to treat a number of us, which is very stupid, and you are showing all interest in pulling things together. Don't both ask anything, bother, I should say, asking anything from me again. He goes on to say, also, this shows exactly how you've rigged it. It is disgusting. You are using her death, this is the death of the Queen, to punish people who are just supportive. Absolutely disgusting. Wendy Morton responding, Gavin, again, this is not the case whatsoever. Well, let's see, he says, how many more times you F us all over. There is a price for everything. Tom, is this really the level of discourse between parliamentarians? Is this how people talk to each other in the House of Commons?
I think that a number of members, including the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet, have made it clear that they found that those messages were unacceptable. Being a member of Parliament can be a very stressful time. Sometimes we get really frustrated about different things. But I could never imagine myself being in a position where I would communicate like that to any colleague.
You've never communicated. Have you ever received messages like that?
No, I haven't. I spent many times where I get frustrated by things, but you usually just take a deep breath and actually before you send messages like that. There is an investigation ongoing, and that will come up with any conclusions about
what do you need an investigation for? If you've already decided, as the Prime Minister has, that it's unacceptable, as you agree, what are you investigating?
Well, I think just because something's unacceptable doesn't necessarily mean that the immediate outcome of something being unacceptable is for that person to lose their job. That isn't automatic. So I think the investigation will allow more thought in terms of what the next steps are. But I've said what I've said. I think those messages are unacceptable. I can't imagine myself ever sending messages like that. And then others will decide.
Do you ever get messages like that? I mean, are there WhatsApp groups between MPs talking to each other like that?
And I'll tell you what's really offensive about that is Tom's right that we often get frustrated about things that affect our constituents. But this just reeks of self-entitlement. He felt he personally should be at the Queen's funeral. There's millions of people in the country who would have loved to have been at the Queen's funeral, but they don't go bullying the Chief Whip of the government to do it. And it really does This guy was appointed to the cabinet by Rishi Sunak, who apparently was aware that there were texts, but not what the detail of them was. But he knew he'd been leaking defence information before he was sacked as Defence Secretary. He knew the fiasco that he'd caused over A-levels during lockdown, and yet he still brought him back, just like he brought back Suella Braverman, despite her having been sacked 6 days earlier for breaching security rules as the Home Secretary, supposedly in charge of national security. This actually calls into judgment the Prime Minister's decisions, not these individual ministers.
Well, we're seeing Gavin Williamson here, as you say, former Education Secretary, former Chief Whip. Do you think he should stay in the job after seeing those WhatsApp messages, Tom?
Yeah. I mean, the Prime Minister has to make a decision about who's in his cabinet, who's in his government. I've said I find that those messages unacceptable. The Prime Minister will look at everything in a round, he'll look at the job that Gavin is doing where he is, and he'll come to a conclusion, weighing everything up. And that's a matter for a Prime Minister.
Right, well, let's have a look at another headline referring to Gavin Williamson when he was Chief Whip. Chief Whip, obviously the sort of manager, if you like, of MPs and trying to persuade them to hold the government line. The Times headline is Gavin Williamson's tacit threat to MP over private life. Charlotte, 'twas ever thus. Is it that we just hear about these things far more than we used to? Certainly whips have reverted to fairly dubious tactics and strategy to persuade MPs to do as they're told.
I think that's certainly true, and as you say, we now do hear an awful lot more about it. So what happened with this particular story on the front page of the Times today is this MP at the time in 2016 was a backbencher running a campaign which was causing the government a bit of bother, went in to speak to the then Chief Whip about that, and then he appears to, over the course of that conversation, also raise something about her private life. She viewed this as a bit of a tacit threat, a sort of, you wouldn't want this to come out, would you? He, or at least allies of Gavin Williamson, say that he was just raising this as a separate pastoral issue. And I think actually what you're seeing there is a big structural problem with how discipline is managed in Westminster, because the same people who are in charge of discipline, in charge of getting MPs in line, getting them to vote the right way, are often as well in charge of pastoral issues. So the same person you should speak to if you're having a problem at home is the person who then is trying to compel you to vote in a certain way. And I think a lot of the mess comes from that, to be honest.
I mean, what about then relations between Conservative MPs? I mean, we've heard Tom saying people get frustrated. He wouldn't use that sort of language. But what does it say about the state of the party and the way parliamentarians address each other?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think it's amazing that people are saying this is part of the rough and tumble of politics. We had this during the Me Too scandal 5 years ago when it was just, it was all part of the kind of, this is what you have to accept, and it's not acceptable. This is bullying, threatening behaviour by someone not only who is an MP in public life, but is in the cabinet, and it shouldn't be happening. And this is not, there is a way to run a whip's office and to persuade your MPs to vote in a certain way, but this crosses a line. And I think, Rishi Sunak came in, he's Mr. Integrity. He was supposed to come in after Boris Johnson, who had lost integrity over his job. He's soaking up a lot of goodwill over Gavin Williamson, and you just have to sort of wonder what Gavin Williamson's hold is over the Prime Minister, that he is still in his job. Tom?
I don't think Gavin Williamson has any hold over a Prime Minister. I think the Prime Minister, I'm very confident in the Prime Minister. I think he's made a solid start as Prime Minister. And I think over time he'll win the trust of the British people. I'm very confident.
But do you think he's tough enough in that regard to keep his cabinet in check and ministers in check?
I don't know what's going to happen about Gavin Williamson. I just don't know. I would say I hear a lot of stories about what happens in the Whip's office. Personally, I've never experienced any of those to myself. I've had Whips try and convince me to vote a certain way, but they just use arguments to about why I should. I've never been threatened. I have rebelled a couple of times in the past, and they've tried to get me not to rebel, but they've just made other arguments like about why I should vote a certain way. I haven't been.
All right. Well, there's some candor there. What about you?
Well, I don't think the issue is that Rishi Sunak's too weak to manage an ungovernable Conservative party, is the truth of it. It's not just Williamson. I mean, what is his job anyway? Minister without portfolio? What's he in there for, actually?
Well, the job's been around for quite a long time, hasn't it, Steve?
But it's not just him. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, put back in 6 days after she was sacked because Sunak had to do a grubby deal with the extreme right wing of his own party to avoid a contest to become leader of the Conservative Party.
And
the reason they wanted to avoid that contest...
There we have it.
The reason they wanted to avoid that contest is because Liz Truss beat him.
Okay,
all right. Well, you've said
the mask slips.
Let Tom.
The mask slips, Okay,
He's
so we
part
have
of the extreme right
so we
wing.
have the Labour Party who try and make it seem that they understand the public's concerns about immigration. Yet they describe somebody like Suella Braverman, who speaks for a majority of people in the country on immigration matters, as extreme
hang on,
right.
do we know
She's
that she
not
speaks...
extreme
Suella
right.
Do we
Braverman
know
wants to
she...
withdraw from the European
There is a silent
Convention on Human
majority.
Rights. That's something
A
that
silent
Vladimir
majority.
Putin has done.
A silent majority of the
extreme.
country, I
Don't
bet
talk
you,
over each other.
agree with Suella Braverman's views on immigration. There's been polling done over a weekend that actually says millions of people agree with Suella Braverman. She is not the extreme right. I'm not the extreme right. We're just desperately concerned about uncontrolled immigration.
Well, let's, Steve,
Do you think it's OK for the Home Secretary to breach security rules when she's responsible for national security and then be brought back 6 days later? Because that's what Rishi Sunak did. And the reason he did that, he can't have wanted somebody that incompetent being in that job. The reason he did it, he had to cut a deal with the right wing of his own party to avoid a leadership contest. And he was frightened of a leadership contest because he lost the previous one to Liz Truss and she lost to a lettuce. Yeah. So that is the strength of the man we've got leading the Conservative Party.
So I spoke to the Prime Minister and I supported him, and I made public my support for him a couple of weeks ago. And I spoke to him about the small boats crisis, and he won my confidence.
Did you talk about Suella Braverman?
Are you happy with her being back?
I'm happy about Suella Braverman being Home Secretary. Absolutely.
Right.
I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to her about tackling this issue.
All right.
Okay. If she is, I think she's. I saw her in the chamber last week. Ultimately, the public will judge Suella Braverman on whether she deals with the small boats crisis. That will be the key thing.
All right, we're going to move on because it's not just people in the cabinet; it's people out of the cabinet. In fact, former prime ministers for Rishi Sunak to deal with. Let's have a look at this tweet from BBC Politics. Boris Johnson glad Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is at COP27, the climate change conference in Egypt. The former prime minister says he is there as a foot soldier and spear carrier of the Conservative Party, purely in a supportive role to remind the world of what we did in Glasgow. Do you think Rishi Sunak is pleased that Boris Johnson is at COP as well as him?
No, I don't think he is. I mean, it's fascinating actually that obviously Rishi Sunak was, became leader in a coronation last week because Boris Johnson, and 2 weeks ago because Boris Johnson and Penny Mordaunt pulled out. But really fascinating that Graham Brady revealed last week that he did get 100 MPs. There is a legitimacy there that Boris Johnson supporters feel that he has to still be on the front line in British politics. And clearly Boris Johnson feels that too. And he's not going to be sort of like Ted Heath or David Cameron and going off to a shepherd's hut.
For a long sulk.
He's right in the thick of it.
Right, well, we can see pictures of him there, right in the thick of it, to coin a phrase. Charlotte, do you think actually, in a way, that Boris Johnson is one of those people who does have some sort of traction when it comes to the issue of climate change?
Certainly, it was a big thing he chose to prioritise when he was Prime Minister. It's something that he put front and centre. It's something the Conservative Party have increasingly tried to put front and centre, essentially because they realised that the public did not have a sense of which party they preferred on this issue. This started to happen under Theresa May, and the Conservatives have leaned rather dramatically into it. Boris Johnson, I think, is someone who, as well, looked more like he was happy when he was on the world stage. He likes being at this type of conference. He likes going out and glad-handing people. And actually, in a way, he's now got the dream job because he can do that without any of the responsibilities of actually getting anything to happen.
We'd all like that without the responsibilities. Are you pleased he's there, Boris Johnson?
I don't have a particularly strong view. But if he wants to be there as a spear carrier and
a foot soldier, I'm very happy for him to do that. Look, I think this is a good opportunity for the new Prime Minister to, yes, talk about climate change, but also talk with world leaders about other issues. And I understand that when he's there, he's talking to President Macron about that issue about small boats. Well, let's talk. Well, we've talked about the small boats issue at some length. Let's concentrate on the substance at the rest of it at the Climate Change Summit, because one of the questions that has been debated and was asked actually of your colleague Ed Miliband yesterday, the Shadow Climate Secretary, is about whether poorer countries affected already quite seriously by climate change should get payments to deal with it. Let's have a listen.
This is about the issue of so-called loss and damage. This is the fact that poorer countries are facing massive effects of climate change. Poorer countries are on the front line of the climate crisis. Pakistan had these disastrous floods recently, 30% of the country underwater. So this is about global solidarity. I mean, yes, we have some historical responsibility, but this is about global solidarity.
Should poorer countries, in the way that Ed Miliband has outlined, get loss and damage payments or reparations?
Absolutely not, and particularly I've heard rumours that even under some proposals we'd be paying China.
Although Ed Miliband was very keen to say he wasn't including China.
I think it's clear that, you know, for our international aid programme, we're already making significant contributions to many developing countries. The question is that in addition to that, we make further £1 billion payments at a time where many of our constituents are struggling with cost of living. Absolutely, I do not agree with Ed Miliband's position.
Steve?
Well, the Conservatives were elected on a manifesto that said they would keep 0.7% of GDP on international development, and they've broken that promise. And I think when a party's elected, they should stick to the promises they make. Now, it's actually connected with the small boats issue and the migration crisis, because because of climate change, people in poorer countries are forced off land that once was arable, farmable, and have to move away. It ends in more people trying to get out of that country and cross, whether it's the Mediterranean or the English Channel, to get to climates that are safer. So actually, part of dealing with the mass migration of populations is dealing with climate change, and there is a UN brokered deal that allocates to countries a proportion that they will fund. The UK has actually been pretty good at meeting our commitments. Some other countries haven't.
Well, we can look at pictures, Tom, before you respond. The devastating floods in Pakistan, one example of consequences of extreme weather events that have occurred this year. I mean, what is wrong with paying reparations, Tom, to countries like Pakistan after we have been able to burn fossil fuels for, you know, hundreds of years, and yet now these countries are able to do so? They're being told not to, and they are on the front line of these sorts of weather events.
At a time where, as colleagues, we will be, you know, very concerned about the welfare of our constituents as we face a huge cost of living challenge. No, I do not support the concept of sending billions of pounds of further money abroad right now. You know, and it is interesting that the Labour Party seem to be doubling down on this. I'm really not sure where they'd find the money from, for one. But I think that, you know, we're making that international aid commitment, but I do not support the idea of reparations.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, I agree with him on that point. Reparations is a loaded term, and this shouldn't be about that. But I think, you know, we are on the planet. We want the planet not to burn because that harms all of us, and we want people not to be forced out of their own countries when it ends up in a migration crisis here. But collectively, we have to move forward together on this.
Right.
Reparations isn't the right word. That's a loaded term. But we do need to work together as a global community to deal with this crisis that ultimately damages all of our futures and our children's futures.
Well, then, just to be clear, because Ed Miliband was asked and the word was reparations was used, you say it's a loaded term, but are you saying that still that's semantics, but the substance you would still agree with Ed Miliband or not over loss and damage payments?
No, not loss and damage. No, I think we need to be moving forwards together as a global community to tackle climate change, and that's what COP26,
so you
COP27...
OK, so you don't agree with Ed Miliband on this?
Well, you know, the UK government has made commitments to the amount of international development funding that it will contribute. The Conservatives were elected on one figure, and they've changed it. Actually, I think that contributes to, for instance, the migrant crisis that we're seeing. And if the money that they've cut from international development was instead used to track down the people traffickers and to deal with climate change, the problem in Calais wouldn't be so acute. These things are connected. You can't just separate them out.
Right, but Ed Miliband is saying a Labour government would fund loss and damage payments. You're saying a Labour government wouldn't.
Well, that's not my understanding, but I didn't hear what Ed said, to be fair. I just saw that clip just now, but I didn't watch the interview.
Well, it was clear that Ed Miliband was saying, yes, something should be paid, whether you call it loss and damage or reparations. Let me just show you this headline in the Daily Mail. This is how they interpreted the comments by Ed Miliband yesterday. Red Ed, UK must pay climate change damages. Obviously, that is the idea firmly put at Labour's door. But the Telegraph, actually, Tom Hunt suggests the government may be warming to the idea. Britain opens door to climate reparations. So?
I certainly haven't come across that.
And you wouldn't support it?
That isn't the government's position that they support that. So that's not the government's position.
Right, and you wouldn't want the door open to those discussions?
I think we're taking ambitious steps to cut our carbon emissions. We've got an ambitious UK aid programme. It's absolutely wrong to go down the Labour route, which is unfunded £1 million commitments. In addition to that...
No one said that.
Well, he has. I mean, Ed Miliband was asked about that. It was quite clear what he said. We watched Ed Miliband clip.
Well, this is interesting. So we've got two MPs here, neither of whom would like to see reparations or loss and damage payments in the way I understood Ed Miliband to have set out. What's your response? Is this going to become the issue for countries like the UK?
Yeah, I think it's a really good... It's interesting, actually, that we're now talking about climate change in an economic economic context, and that should have been made for years, because it's all about the economy. It's all about, and I think Steve's got a very good point here, that we have to think long term. It is about the future of the whole planet, and there is going to be more migration because of climate change, and that's a really strong argument. I think there is an argument here for, obviously we're in a cost of living crisis, and no one's talking about X million pounds have to be paid now, but it's about a future, possibly a future plan to just level up some of the inequity, because we in the global north have been burning fossil fuels for decades. And I think there is an argument, but also that it should be the companies should also have to pay for some of this. The companies that are making billions of pounds of profits, they should be donating some money towards countries like Pakistan. I think they've ruled out China, actually, just to correct you on that, but Pakistan, which has suffered unprecedented flooding, and that is going to have a knock-on effect for the rest of for the whole planet.
But I think the way, we've got a UK aid programme. I think the way to, if you think that needs to be more generous to cover.
Well, it's been cut back. The aid has been cut back.
I would just make that. I mean, we're in an incredibly difficult position right now, where a lot of our constituents are struggling to pay their bills, and I make no apology about in the short term prioritising my constituents in that regard. But I think that there are steps that the UK government have taken to support Pakistan and Bangladesh with the flooding that they've experienced. But again, this concept of reparations, I'm not comfortable with, and I don't think we should be going down that route.
I might jump in on the question of aid, because as Jane mentioned there, of course, the government has said it was 0.7, that was the target, that was the manifesto commitment, now down to 0.5, and that will change and go back up again once Rishi Sunak sees debt falling and borrowing falling. Now that is potentially quite a long way off, we'll have to wait and see, but there's a fascinating story on the front page of the Times today, essentially saying on top of that, 3.5 billion of the 11.4 billion left in the budget is now being spent here on people who come here, refugees, asylum seekers, which is fascinating. I think that's probably a good allocation of resources, in that we know that we do need to look after people who are seeking asylum. But, of course, every penny there goes away from the aid budget overseas. And this is just a sense, really, of the big fight coming down the line for the government, because already you've got people on the front page of the Times saying this is a problem, we need to see an increase in that budget if it's getting split in that way. And this is just one area. Think of every single government department which is going to be having each separate fight. This is going to be a complete fiscal nightmare for the government, and a political one. And,
of course, we'll hear more about that on November the 17th. Steve, what were you going to say?
Well, it's just, I mean, those costs you're talking about there, it's a real cost of failure of this government. So 7 million a day they're spending to put asylum seekers up in hotels, 2.2 billion a year, simply because they can't process more than 4% in a year. Well, these things all connect.
They do, but if we can return briefly to the idea of whether there is any moral compulsion on behalf of UK government to pay countries like Pakistan, a country that many people would say, well, actually, there's a nuclear weapons programme there.
I think no, but the British people are very... When we had these disaster relief funds that are open, the British people contribute to this because they care about it. Our government generally will contribute as well, because there's a sense of global solidarity. I don't think that is out of moral compunction. I think that is out of the generous spirit of the British people. But if we want to tackle the root causes of this, we have to look at what we can do as a global community to defeat climate change. And currently, it doesn't look like we're doing anything like enough.
Well, I mean, the UK government, did provide support for those suffering the effects of those floods in Pakistan and Bangladesh. That isn't a new thing. It's something that we did, and I'm proud that we did it. I have a lot of Bangladeshi constituents, for example, who were very, very concerned about what's happening in Bangladesh, and we did provide support. You can make an argument maybe it wasn't enough support, too more, but I think ultimately, in principle, that is something the government are already doing.
Let's have a look a little closer to home in terms of climate change. This headline, BBC News, climate change decarbonising UK public buildings to cost 25 to 30 billion pounds. It was the finding of Freedom of Information request by the Sunday with Laura Kunsberg show. Now, the government says that's an indicative figure based on today's prices and shouldn't be seen as the actual budget. Would it be money well spent, Tom?
Look, we've got to meet we've got our climate change commitments. What's the most effective way of going about meeting?
Well, would that be one of them?
I think in terms of new buildings, we obviously need to be looking at ways to make them more better for the environment. I generally don't know whether that. It's the first I've heard of it, and I would give you. We've got these targets you've got to meet.
Yes,
but of course.
This is an interesting debate, though, isn't it, Steve? Because if you want to start decarbonising buildings, and people are talking about residential homes, but if you just started with public buildings, that's the cost.
And you're right, it's not just public buildings, it's domestic homes. We know we've got the least well-insulated homes in Northern Europe, and a vast amount of the money that people are paying in energy bills goes through the roof and the wall. So there's a saving to be made by insulating, and what you would do is you'd look at the investment over a period of time against the savings that you make, and it would become cost-effective as well as helping us achieve net zero. So that is what the government should be looking at. It's an investor save scheme.
Personally, though, in principle, this is a really important debate about how we tackle climate change. But in the short term, as an MP, I have a responsibility to my constituents, and money is tight, and I would like to see money prioritised and helping them get through this difficult period. And I think if there's a way which we can kill two birds with one stone, great. But in the short term, I'm waking up thinking about how I help.
Well, insulated homes does do that. It cuts up to 500 quid.
Also, it might be one of those.
Bills, so
it might be one of those.
We should have already done that.
It might be one of those things that kills two birds with one stone. Then that might be one of those examples.
Let's talk about the World Cup, which is being held in Qatar, starting on the 20th of November. Gary Neville, former England footballer and coach, is going and commentating there during the World Cup. He was also hosting Have I Got News for You on Friday night. Let's have a listen. Is it a good enough defence, Steve Reed? I mean, Gary Neville is a Labour Party activist. He's not only going, but he's commentating there, so he will be taking Qatari money, no doubt, for that commentating. Is it a good enough defence to say it can be raised?
Individuals will take their own decisions about the situation in Qatar. Now, the World Cup is going to be there. I'm not in favour of a boycott. I want the England team to go there. I want them to get as close to winning, if not winning it, as they possibly can. I'll be cheering them on as they do that. But people will take their own view about whether to go or not to go. Personally, I wouldn't go. I've not been
you wouldn't go?
anyway,
Keir Starmer's not going.
Keir's not going. I think some government ministers are going. But it's important that we all raise the issues about the abuse of migrant workers, many of whom have died building these stadiums, and the fact that our lesbian and gay football fans from our country are going to a country where they can be arrested and locked up and subject to conversion torture simply because of their sexuality, not because of public displays of affection. And we need to call that out in a way that actually James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, failed to do when he told people to just put up with it.
Well, he said be deeply respectable. Was that right, Tom?
I'm not sure what the Foreign Secretary said, but
he said that.
I think many of us were deeply perplexed. I think it was probably about 9 or 10 years ago, where on the same day FIFA announced Russia 2018 and Qatar 2022, because in fact we had our own bid for 2018. I think the decision by FIFA to host it in Qatar is bizarre. I think the fact it's happening in winter because it's just no one thought about how hot it gets in the summer is odd. But with Gary Neville, the reality is he's taken a decision that he wants to wade into politics from time to time. He should expect that if he's going to do that, the spotlight is on him, and if there's any hypocrisy, it will be pointed out.
Jane?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, this is politics, isn't it? You can't just say I'm a footballer. I can't, talk about this. I think there are two things here. It's really important that we don't boycott the World Cup because it's football and we, have great teams.
So do you think it's odd that Sir Keir Starmer's not going?
But as footballers shouldn't boycott it. But I think the difference for Gary Neville is he's being paid by the state broadcaster. He says he's going to raise it. Is he really? I think raising things and being part of a discussion, it has to be meaningful. Is he really going to engage? And so it's good that we are having this debate because we are in the World Cup. We've qualified and we are having the debate because we're going. We wouldn't be having this debate now, so it's important to have that. But I think taking money directly from the Qatari government or state broadcaster is very questionable, and I think Gary Neville is going to find very hard to defend that.
Charlotte?
I completely agree. I don't think there's any risk of any sports broadcaster trying to hire me as a commentator, but I think if the Qatari state broadcaster came calling, I definitely would be wildly uncomfortable about doing it. And I think this speaks to a broader problem as well about sports washing. You do see ownership of some fairly unsavoury states of British football clubs, and that does, in a way, improve their reputation. And you do see people somewhat coming to terms with some of these regimes as a result of it, and I think it's very dangerous.
Is it difficult, though, to draw a line between certain states in terms of the sort of moral dilemmas that might be posed? I mean, I'll show you some pictures here of the red arrows on exercise over Qatar at the weekend, actually underlining a fairly long-standing military partnership between Britain and Qatar. I mean, should they not be doing that either?
I think there's a difficult decision that I think all world leaders need to confront, and that's the fact that if you look at every single country in the world, there are many that are really, really bad, and there are some that are not where we'd like them to be. And we've got to make a pragmatic decision, because if we say we're only going to deal with countries that are absolutely where we are in terms of Western values, we're going to have a difficult job. So I think we've got to make there's got to be a red line in there. Whether Qatar, what side of it they fall, I think is a matter for debate.
Yeah. I mean, would you end the military partnership with Qatar?
Well, you know, for once I agree with Tom, which is pleasing on this.
Well, it's taken almost the whole programme, but anyway...
We have to be pragmatic about these things, you know. We wouldn't have very many global alliances if we ruled out countries that we don't agree with an awful lot of things on.
All right. Well, military partnerships may continue. I mean, let's take this theme a little bit further and actually go back to the climate summit in Egypt. This is the headline in The Guardian. Greta Thunberg to skip greenwashing COP27 climate summit in Egypt. Swedish climate activist says the UN's climate conference will be used as an opportunity for leaders and people in power to get attention. Is she right, or is that a bit harsh?
I can't criticise Greta Thunberg on this issue at all, but I think it's really important that the summit is happening and that there are world leaders there, that you've got President Biden, you've got Rishi Sunak going to say how important it is. I think if they don't go because they think it's greenwashing, then they're just answering their own question, they're just not engaging. But I think it's the same with the World Cup, it's got to be meaningful. And I think last year was a real disappointment in Glasgow, that all the sort of high sort of aspirations that Britain had and that the world had, they didn't come to fruition, and we're just very, very slowly. I mean, what I was going to say about the insulation issue of government buildings, where is the roadmap from either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party to net zero? We can't even decide whether we're going to have Sizewell C or not. It was up in the air last week. Everything's up in the air because of the autumn statement. There is no roadmap from either party about how we're going to get there. And it's 28 years away, but those 28 years will come very quickly when we already have climate change happening now.
Right. I mean, if we look at this, I mean, Greta Thunberg is skipping it because of general human rights concerns, but there is a very specific example. This BBC News headline, COP27, jailed activist Alaa Abdel Fattah stops drinking water. He has obviously been imprisoned and held for quite a substantial amount of time. Again, the Prime Minister said he'll raise the issue of the hunger striker himself, but will it be meaningful?
In terms of the intervention from the Prime Minister, I think this is a tricky one, because always when you have these conferences, everyone comes with different things that they want to talk about, and everybody always ends up maybe raising them slightly around the sides, but they never become the main focus. Plus, on top of that as well, you end up with world leaders with very specific accords that they need to sign off. So I'd be surprised if the entire conference becomes about human rights and about the Egyptian state. Instead, I would expect more of the focus to be on climate change, and perhaps those can be raised at future times. But these diplomatic conferences are a complete nightmare in terms of all these different countries, as you say, some which we consider to be abhorrent, some which we consider to be a bit borderline, all in one place, all trying to agree on something.
Right. I mean, it is difficult to navigate. I think we can see pictures of the jailed activist Alaa Abdel Fattah here. I mean, the line being trodden by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is raising it, but we never know whether these things are ever raised or what the metric of success is.
No, and, you know, it's a good thing that Rishi Sunak's now going, because he originally said he wasn't going until he was forced into doing a U-turn a couple of days ago. But the situation with COP is, it's not perfect, but it's all we've got. And we need some forum that brings world leaders together to focus on what we can do collectively as a planet to protect the future of the planet, given the climate crisis. And I don't entirely agree with you that neither party is coming up with proposals. The Labour Party at our conference in Liverpool came up with a plan to convert the UK economy to become the first economy on the planet that is entirely powered by green energy by 2030.
10 seconds.
I don't buy this idea that this is some kind of dramatic U-turn. I think the Prime Minister was asked a couple of days into his job whether he was going to go or not, and I think he was like, well, I'm not sure yet. And now he's going.
And on that,
he's discussing many things other than just climate change.
And he's there. From all of us here, thank you. Bye-bye.